All right, we're going to go ahead and get started now. You may think of Houston as the energy capital of the world. I know I did. But no industry better symbolizes the diversification of Houston's economy than healthcare. Around 1.3 million individuals are employed in the healthcare sector across the state. The Texas Medical Center, located right here in Houston, is the largest medical complex in the world. Healthcare has been a core part of Houston's effort to attract investment in technology and innovation, with venture capital funds pouring more than $2 billion into its startups. The next discussion focuses on how the health system is leveraging innovations in science to grow this investment and the workforce in service of not only the economy, of course, but the people that live and work here and around the globe. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, our moderator, Dr. Joachim Reiser, President of the University of Texas Medical Branch, CEO, UTMB Health Science Professor John Seeley School of Medicine, and the John D. Stobo, MD, Distinguished Chair. Dr. Phyllis Barkman, Farrell Davos, Alzheimer's Collaborative, Timothy Lash, President, West Health Institute, Dr. Giulio Taglata, Lawrence J. Del Papa, Distinguished Chair in Neurodegenerative Disease Research, Vice President of Brain Health, UTMB, and Director of the Moody Brain Health Institute, and Dr. Andrew Trister, Chief Medical and Scientific Officer for Verify. Please welcome to the stage.
Are we ready?
Ready.
I guess we're on. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for a very, very kind introduction. You can probably see from the complexity of the names that were introduced, this is a very astute panel and with a lot of diversity, which is wonderful. We're bringing it back to healthcare delivery now this afternoon. I think it's really important that when we talk about changing brain economy, we talk about healthcare and science. And fitting to that is the title of our session, From Discovery to Delivery, the Economic Value of Accelerating Healthcare Innovations. It's really an honor to be here. When I was asked to be the moderator, I love being the moderator, and I love to learn from all of you and from our very distinguished panel. I'm a physician scientist by training, molecular biologist, and a nephrologist. And the kidneys also have a cortex, just like the brain. But over the last year or two, I've become to really appreciate what it means when we talk about changing brain economy and how important it is. UTMB is a very large university with all kinds of educational missions around health. And we have the oldest medical and nursing school and a very large health delivery network that some of you might heard of or have used. Right now is a very special time in healthcare. We are really at a very transformative moment. We're talking about AI. AI for me means actual intelligence as well as artificial intelligence. And it's somewhat telling that in the time where artificial intelligence is becoming a growing topic, we think of the health of our actual intelligence and a changing brain economy. This acceleration that we are seeing is not just improving outcomes, it's also unlocking very significant economic value. From reducing inefficiencies in healthcare costs to boosting workforce productivity, public health, innovation is to become a very powerful engine in healthcare. And today we'll explore how each of our panelists is helping bridge the gap between discovery and delivery, and what it will take to ensure that these breakthroughs reach the people and communities who need them most. So what we are doing is we're giving each of our panelists now about a 2 to 3 minute time frame to introduce themselves, and then we begin our conversations. So please, Phyllis Barkman-Farrell, Dr. Farrell, please go ahead and start introducing.
My name is Phyllis Farrell, and I'm here from Indiana, thus the it's race weekend, right? So I recently retired, about 18 months ago, retired from Eli Lilly and Company after almost 3 decades of life sciences career. The first half of that career was a pretty traditional commercial career, so global marketing and sales, largely in neuroscience. About 15 years ago, I was tapped to lead the late-stage Alzheimer's drug development and diagnostic development team. And the side part of that story is 6 months after I took that job, my dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So I led a very personal and professional journey for the second half of my career. During the pandemic, I had the pleasure of being put on secondment, an executive on loan, and worked with George to create the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. At the same time, I realized that we had a real problem with public health and clinical medicine as it related to Alzheimer's disease and brain health. So we'd been incredibly successful with the multinationals, so the G7, G20, OECD, World Health Organization, United Nations, but nothing was dropping down to actually change at the bedside of the patient. That was the creation of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, and given that I spend a lot of time lecturing on brain health and being a lifelong learner, I also decided to get my PhD. So at age 50, I got a PhD and changed my career from life sciences to consulting now for public health and clinical health on Alzheimer's and brain health. So really pleased to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing this with us. Timothy Lash is our next panelist. If you mind, go ahead and introduce yourself to us.
Sure, and I'll try to do introductions and just a little framing of how we think about this. So Tim Lash, President of West Health. For those that aren't familiar, we work at the intersection of healthcare delivery and policy, really trying to drive more affordability, higher reliability of our healthcare system, and specifically in the context of an aging population, which is happening globally. We've deployed about $1 billion to date. We'll deploy another $1.5 billion plus in-kind contributions over the next 10 years. And I think this is a historic time for us to be having this discussion. I think we're in the midst of a global shakeup or rebalancing in many ways. And I think that brain health and primary care are right in the center of it. And I think there's 3 forces, 2 that are very powerful in a positive way, 1 that's pretty concerning that we have to pay attention to. So, one, just from a public payer perspective, whether you're in Europe or in the US, there's, I think, a recognition that we have to get control and bending the curve, right? And, that's, certainly a big focus on primary prevention, tertiary prevention, and there, when we think about things like Alzheimer's, anxiety, depression, and just brain health in general, that's at the root of it, and the solutions there, right? Really, I think, rest in an integrated system where primary care is at the center. The second positive force is employers and employees, right? I think are really recognizing the need to do something here. You heard a lot today, around brain capital. Familiar there, but not going to repeat that. But certainly employers are seeing that you have to go way beyond employer assistance programs, and think holistically about their own internal culture and structure, and also the health system that they're contracting for to be able to deliver that. And frankly, employees, right, are closing the gap between the stories we tell and the lives we live, right? The perception reality. Certainly in the U.S., we've delivered, far inferior, sort of globally. And I think they're very positive tailwinds. I think the thing that's most concerning, if you look at any disruptive innovation, and I use the word disruptive very carefully, right? Things can be innovative, but they don't disrupt. And what I mean by disrupt is, do they create friction in the delivery system, right? Changing the site of care, changing who's doing it, cheaper solutions. So think, TAVRs, right? The transcatheter aortic valve replacement, stents. I come from the device world, right? All of these things fundamentally changed where care was shifted, and it happened because there were procedural pull-throughs on the back end. There were profits, right, that drove that. And unfortunately, as we're talking about the brain and we're talking about what has to happen in the changes of delivery system, as it exists in our payment models today, right, there are not those procedural pull-throughs at scale from a profit perspective that will drive the type of shift that we need to see. So as we get into this, pedal on the metal on the discovery side, but there's a shake-up on delivery and there's tailwinds, but I think that there's some things that we have to talk about how you do that and how you motivate that from a policy perspective that if not addressed, we'll be having this same conversation a decade from now.
Great. Thank you. Welcome to the panel. Next is Dr. Taklia Latela. our director at UTMB of the Moody Brain Health Institute, Giulio.
Okay, I want to thank you, my co-panelists, and now you make me feel my life boring compared to yours. But I got trained, did all my training back in my home country, Italy, Rome, less than a mile from the Vatican. You cannot get more Roman than that. And then I actually did postdoctoral training at UTMB many years ago. You don't want to know. And then eventually came back to UTMB in 1993 and never left. And I never left because I fell in love with brain. And I still believe at that time and to these days, neuroscience is really one of the strongest, almost diamond tips of UTMB. And that is where I did most of my career, served in different leadership roles at UTMB, most recently as the director of the Mitchell Center for Neurodegenerative Diseases. And the latest appointment is, in fact, what Dr. Reiser mentioned, as the Vice President for Brain Health and the Director of the Moody Brain Health Institute that was established less than 5 months ago at UTMB. So I'm a neurobiologist by training, and my fascination has always been brain aging, both physiological and, more importantly, pathological. And so my attention focuses on dementia, obviously Alzheimer being the most interesting one, but also I became extremely interested in my new position to really the concept of brain economy, a concept that was foreign to me until recently, and it has become really a big aspect of what I do and what I think within my role at the Moody Brain Health Institute. Told you it was boring.
That's it?
I play soccer. I was a goalkeeper with Lazio, which is an Italian team, pretty famous. And I never played a single game, but I was able to go around all dressed up for the Lazio colors and tell my school friends a lot of lies because they didn't check. But you want to know something else?
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Giulio. Dr. Trister, very excited to have you here. Would you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Andrew Trister. I'm the Chief Medical and Scientific Officer at Verily. We're one of the companies owned by Alphabet. So our sister company, Google, Waymo, Intuition, a whole host of other startups. I am also a physician scientist. I trained in radiation oncology, also came to UTMB, actually, but only for a summer, because I lived through a hurricane here in the basement of the hospital with the machines so that we could keep treating people, and then said I'm not coming back. But I'm glad that I'm here today. So it has been a very strange turn, I would say, around my career. So over the last 20 years, I moved from academia. I was in Seattle at the Fred Hutch, into industry, really focused on AI applications for healthcare, which led me to technology. So my PhD work was in bioengineering, although right now we'll just say I did AI then, but it was during the winter of AI, couldn't get funding. It was actually quite difficult to pursue that path all those years ago. And yet, we found a path to do something interesting, first at Apple, building devices that would help people understand their health better and help individuals get greater agency. Then at the Bill and Melinda Gates, or now the Gates Foundation, excuse me, so the Gates Foundation, where I led digital health and AI investing for Bill for about 5 years, and then now at Verily for just over a year in this new role.
Wonderful. Are you the one when I cannot maneuver my Apple Watch?
That's right, yeah.
Are you the reason for that? Or?
No. Anything that doesn't work on the Apple Watch is not my team.
Okay.
So only the things that you like about the Apple Watch.
Okay, great.
No, but Andrew and I did do a brain health study together. That's how we met when I was at Lilly and he was at Apple, and we were looking at the device.
Wonderful. Well, we love those tools, and we'll hopefully talk about it, how we can use them. But brings me to the first question that is directed at Dr. Tagliatella. What are examples of scalable solutions that are closing the time gap between research and implementation for mental and neurological health conditions? Giulio.
Oh yeah, thank you for that question. Since it touches an area that I believe I've been thinking about it a lot and investigated. Well, there is an objective. Well, when we deal with, for example, trying to devise approaches for diseases that are indeed chronic, that cannot be evaluated by the immediate effect of a certain drug. And so you require to do one single clinical trial, you require years sometimes, with no guarantees eventually that the clinical trial may lead to any results. So that poses a major, major hurdle to testing the new ideas, to testing a very high number of drugs, even to testing crazy ideas that are there that could move forward. In other words, when you think of Alzheimer's, just to determine a beneficial effect on behavior, on cognitive ability or on a hippocampal value. The hippocampus is a little piece of meat in our brain that allows us to form new memory, which is mostly destroyed in Alzheimer's. So it takes at least 18 months to do that type. So one of the reasons why so few drugs come into the clinical trial phase is indeed because they present a real challenge. So how can we go around? So there is a bottleneck there. And again, for chronic disease, the bottleneck becomes a really, really tight passage. So how can we send to the passage drugs that have been with the highest probability of being successful? And that is where, as mentioned by Dr. Reiser, AI actually can come into place. It's something we are doing actually at the Institute. AI offers the possibility of replicating clinical data from actual patients into AI-driven systems that are normally called patient virtual twins. And these systems, that are AI-driven, are capable of anticipating, for example, the response of a given cohort of patients that would give to any given drug, even if you don't have the drug, but you have an idea, and you can modify the system and observe how an actual cohort of patients would respond. So that brings two benefits, which I think are tremendous, to overcome this hurdle. First of all, you can simulate the pass of time, okay? And so that question can be answered very, very quickly. And two, the system may anticipate what are undesired effects or even desired side effects that you don't anticipate, so on and so forth. But most importantly, it gives you, and that's the hope for the future, it gives you the ability of a high throughput screening, not on a single event, but actually on a response of a patient cohort. And I believe that developing this particular system will be a tremendous contribution to the future to really address this major impediment when we try to translate what we do at the bench into the clinical practice. And and this is scalable, by the way, because you can imagine UTMB having such system, and then other sister institutions in Texas, for example, may contribute their patient data and gain access to the system. And now you have a system containing all the data or reflecting patient twins of all the Texas patients, say, affected by Alzheimer's disease. So think big. And now you go at the national level. And now you can create a huge database, AI-driven, that will be reflective of all patients in the United States. And since I like to think big, because, you know, if you think big, if you fail, at least you fail on something big. So why not? What about global? And having a system, global, open to all, that would be capable of anticipating global responses, or also highlighting what would be the difference of a certain treatment, say, in an African population as compared to a European population, as compared to a US population. So these approaches will be really, really key.
So West Health Institute, when you hear what he's describing, some of these higher throughput methods that have come to be routine now and cut down time, how does it fit with you and what you do?
For sure. So I think this is a great example to pull on the thread, right, of disruption. So this is discovery, right, to delivery, I think is the theme of this talk, right? And, if healthcare was ubiquitous in terms of how one runs a trial, right, then the brain trials would look exactly like the oncology trials. And no one, like recruiting for oncology trials, not very difficult, right? I mean, you have high demand, you have a system that, is set up on how to do it, tighter time frame, et cetera, right? Here we have multiple targets that we're trying to evaluate in the clinic, right? And ultimately one needs to run trials to be able to do that. And as we've seen, right, in some of the recruitment for these trials, right, can be incredibly difficult, right? And so here we have a direct intersection, right, or tension between where the clinic and discovery might be on the science side, right, and where the delivery system is, in terms of the recruitment, right? And so I think it's critical as we think about, right, our work, right, you have to run the preparedness of the delivery side in parallel to the advancements on the clinical side, and they intersect initially on clinical trial recruitment. But that intersection never goes away, because once you have a therapy, right, you have the target and you have something approved, you need to be able to do something with that. And and I think the silos of medicine have persisted, right? But the brain requires a more integrated approach, and that we have not, I think, figured out economically or even operationally at this point. And we are fighting every day to figure out how to do that.
I think this is great, and I want to come to you in 1 second. So I want to make one comment, and that is medicine and science traditionally was very sequential. So you do one thing, you validate it, then you perhaps raise capital, you go to the next step, and that's the classical innovation model that we know, and that is changing. And we have seen an example in COVID, when we do things, and there was an urgent need to do it in parallel, we can do a lot faster and more efficient. And now with computing AI, we can do this as a standard. And that brings a lot of opportunity, but we need a healthy brain to be able to operate that system in the best possible way. Dr. Farrell.
Well, so I was going to kind of shoehorn in the middle, because this point about clinical trial recruiting
and you get ready, Dr. Tristan.
is so important, because that's where we saw the problem first. I was recruiting for these studies. There were 5 million people with Alzheimer's disease in this country, and we didn't have any competing studies. We didn't have any difficult inclusion criteria, and someone ran up to me and said, Phyllis, we've recruited the fastest study ever. I was like, yay, tell me more. And they're like, it only took us 18 months to find 1,000 people. And I was like, okay, we got a massive problem. Now, at this point, I just moved from the commercial side of the business to the medical side. So that's why it hit me. While you started crawling, and what you realized was, oncology is a great example. Nobody gets a cancer diagnosis and doesn't get offered a clinical trial as one of their care options. Less than 1% of Alzheimer's patients ever participate in a clinical trial. And so we started peeling back the onion, and we realized we have this problem. People aren't diagnosed in a timely way. They aren't diagnosed accurately. And then, to Julia's point, if you want to put these models together, you better have an understanding of the basic biology that you're testing, right? And at this point, we didn't have PET scans that were scalable when we started these studies. So I've run now 8 large phase 3 studies, and 4 of them went down the toilet, and we looked back later and 25% of the people didn't have amyloid. And it was an anti-amyloid study. Well, that kind of screws up your stats. So this idea of being able to see something in the brain, so at that point we learned that amyloid started 10 to 20 years before. We had to find a biomarker. We couldn't validate a biomarker from a policy perspective until we'd run years and years and years of studies, right? It wasn't until the donanemab phase 2 study that anyone actually thought amyloid might be able to be a biomarker for this disease. So you've got to have both, right? You've got to have enough of the biology understanding scientifically to be able to inform your models, and then you've got to make sure that those diagnostics are available in the clinic. And I think sometimes we've worked all those things in silos, but in the case of Alzheimer's disease, you just can't.
And I think biomarkers are a great example of where
Yeah.
you need to be able to accelerate them. Because I'm
Big
not the
time,
scientist,
yeah.
but like, is amyloid the marker, or tau, or something else, right? And the only way you're going to know that, right, is to be able to test it, right, and run the experiments. And if you can't recruit, then the timelines, we don't have the time.
And none of them are able to be funded right now. The number of biomarkers that are ready for innovation today, they could go right in a clinical trial, but they can't get funding because you don't have a capital market that drives margin for those. So you're gating your therapeutics with a capital market that we actually can't get funded. So you do just get into this kind of cycle, and that's why I think having these multi-sector conversations are so critical.
Very important, and I'm glad you bring up the example, because the reason we need these large clinical trials is because the science is not exactly correct, right? So think about
precise,
it. If we can phenotype every trial patient correctly, you need a lot less trial patients, because you know what you're testing against. And we're trying to correct that error with a large population that we enroll in trials, slows everything down, and we have all kinds of issues with recruitment
And variability,
cost and variability and all of that. Dr. Trist, how do we fix this at Alphabet?
Yeah, so I think to begin with, I couldn't agree more with what was said already. I think that the measurement question that we face right now is at the very core of why things go so slowly. So if the entry point has to be a recruitment of a trial or a management of a large-scale digital twin, we have to know what is it that we're going to include that has any value whatsoever as a surrogate marker for something that we would have. So if I were to borrow from my experience as an oncologist, albeit we didn't use drugs, but we were still trying to figure out exactly the same question. The issue is that we don't have good surrogate markers in any of the diseases in neuropsychiatric conditions, with very, very few, right? We don't have the imaging correlations worked out. PET has been transformative, right? We only now are starting to see blood biomarkers that have some predictive ability, but that has taken decades of effort to develop. These are things that, at the end of the day, when we think about medicine in practice, but also with respect to how we run clinical studies, there's the loss, as an engineer, it's like you lose delta T. Like you sort of transform this thing into a single time point, and you have to make a decision today. And what do you learn as a medical student in the first year? Give it the tincture of time. Like have the patient come back in 3 months, right? See whether it declares itself. These things, I have to say, like for myself, I was like, what is happening? Like I don't understand. We should be able to be definitive. Diagnostics should be definitive. But that is not the way that these things work, right? We know that people are going through their lives in a trajectory, and we only intersect with them when something happens, right? The NIA definition of Alzheimer's disease remains a patient complaint has to be the very first, or family complaint has to be the first step, right? These are relying on people to observe themselves and their loved ones in a way to then declare we have something that needs to be addressed, rather than saying instead, what I think we all want is a more proactive health system, right? The ability to observe people, to understand, are things actually happening in the way that they were happening before, and using the person themselves as a comparator arm for where it is that they are going. If we were to incorporate something like that, right, this would, for those statistical nerds, Bayesian statistics, right, a prior that has a posterior probability, if you're able to take something that we understand about people in that trajectory and start to use that as a form of a biomarker, as the surrogate to say, this is where they're going to land, right? They're going downhill faster than they may have done if we did something different, but we don't have those measurements. And suddenly what's occurring though is that our entire lives, and many of you right now in the audience are down like this on the phone instead of listening to us on the stage. And part of that could very well be part of the attention, part of just the way that we behave, but all of it is a cognitive test, right? The opportunity to use mobile phones, ubiquitous computing devices, wearables, all of these things produce some version of a cognitive test every single day as people are doing these things generally. And we can see that behavior changes over time. And Phyllis was mentioning earlier, the study that we ran in a small pilot that then expanded to a larger study while she was at Lilly and I was at Apple, So, historic. But in that study, that's exactly what we found. People with MCI, people with dementia, behaved very stereotypically when you observe them through the lens of how they used an iPhone or an iPad in their daily lives, right? Suddenly, you're getting a sense of these people are behaving differently than the people that didn't have a dementing illness. And as such, you can start to say, like, well, maybe this becomes the lens that allows us to start to understand that things are changing. It's not to say that that's going to be diagnostic. I don't think that that's the goal. But at the very least, start to flag, like, this is the population for whom you may want to do something that's more invasive. Maybe do a PET or some other kind of testing. Or even just to come into Julio's clinic, just to follow, hey, what's happening?
That would be interesting because I'm not a physician. They come to my clinic.
Okay. Into your studies.
Don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Great. Well, you mentioned a lot of potential solutions, some new technologies. Tim, I'm coming to you. How do these new solutions, technologies really benefit quality and access to treatment, but also the global economy?
Yeah, so you mentioned soccer or likely football, and my knowledge of sports is limited at sports ball. So but I'll try to go with the sort of analogies. Sports ball. I don't know a lot about sports. So when you look at a football, right? And I think about delivery, you have structure and you have behavior, right? And ultimately we're going to have to have some realignment of the structure, but it's the behavior that in terms of referral and integration and other things that are really, I think, going to get at the trial recruitment and the coordination and the inefficiencies economically that we need to get to realize the promise of the current and emerging therapies, right? And I think it's technology and other enabling solutions that lie in between them, right? And so I'll give some specific examples. We're working with Northwestern right now to bring collaborative care or just more integrated behavioral health from, I think, initially 6 sites to over 70 across Chicagoland, right? And how do you do that? Well, you can't do it with just Post-its or checklists on top of the EMR, right? You have to hardwire these things in, right? And so I think from an enabling perspective, like not making it optional, but leveraging technology, EMRs and workflows to hardwire it in, make it a care gap if it's not happening, right, is absolutely critical if we're going to, one, make the link between the structure and the behavior and do that in a highly reliable way. AI, I think, is very powerful here to drive the efficiencies. We don't have enough providers, right? So how can we have more efficient ways of managing, the data, right, and the patient, right, and their trajectory. And I think if you think about it through that structure of, like fundamentally what policy and, just, physical structure needs to be in place, right, in terms of referrals, et cetera, right? But there's a behavior that we're looking at, and in every case, tying the technology developments to, is it linking the structure and the behavior we want, I think will unlock, one, patient outcomes that we haven't seen before in a much more reliable way, a high reliable health system. Imagine that, right? And I think what comes with that is, dollars saved, right, in terms of the health system that can then be redistributed. If you're in Europe and, there's greater contributions that NATO are required or, share of drug costs, I mean, it's a redistribution that's going to happen. You have to save somewhere. If we're thinking about our systems now in Medicare, we have, an aging population like we've never seen before, Alzheimer's, behavioral health, brain health in general. If it's not addressed, right, it's just going to continue to sort of drain the system.
I think those are great points. And I think if we invest early in our brain health, we're investing longer term in more economic prosperity. And I think that is really the formula that we need to keep driving. The other part I do want to highlight is here in Texas with the DPRIT program. I think we are particularly blessed that our legislator, Lieutenant Governor, put forward a program that has now been supported by both sides, House and Senate, and is most likely going to come to fruition if and when the governor has signed it. And it really puts $3 billion at the center of dementia prevention, Alzheimer prevention, and conditions that are associated with loss of brain power. And that, I think, also is just a sign that there is more and more recognition of economy that comes with a healthy brain. And I think this is wonderful to see. Anybody else who would like to take on the next?
Well, I would just add that I don't think you can find a single country or state that we think is a country, whose GDP grows when their population shrinks. So we are in a situation where we have shrinking populations in our high resource countries. We've got an aging workforce. We have 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 every day. Imagine if you could keep them in the workforce longer. So I think this idea of taking care of our brains earlier, keeping in the workforce longer, those are going to be the economies that win. And being someone who recently retired, I think back to an old AARP that looked at disruptive workforce. And we have these careers that kind of slowly grow, and then we retire and we just go play golf. Or I don't, but I'm failing retirement miserably. But it's a really bad thing, right? It's a bad thing for our brains, it's a bad thing for our bodies, but it's a really bad thing for our communities and our economies. So the way to keep people in the workforce and look for even work structures that allow us to keep people working longer, keep their brains healthier, keep that wisdom in the workforce, I think it's really smart for Texas to do
pull
this.
on one thread there on the demographic shift and aging, because I think it is critical. So globally, we're seeing massive demographic shifts, right? And you can say, so I agree.
In high
right?
resource countries, yeah.
Exactly. From a GDP perspective, right? That's a powerful force, right? But a 40 or 50-year-old today looks like a 65 or 70-year-old, right? In years past, right? And so it's not just the literal aging of the workforce, right? It's like the workers are sicker from a brain perspective and overall health perspective than they were before, right? And so it's not just the pure demographic shift; it's the health status in the context of that demographic shift that is putting major pressure at a GDP level, but also at an employer level that I think is generating the economic incentive to take action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think on this topic, we can borrow from other domains. Just as we talk often about the precision that can be introduced into neuroscience, looking back at what happened in oncology, the same is true now. I mean, there's the hotter area than brain health at the moment happens to be longevity. Not that I approve of that, but if you start to look at what is it that people are doing with the longevity discussion, the actuarial math that goes into those discussions actually has a lot of application for brain health, right? So you have an 80-year average lifespan in the U.S. For kind of mixed genders, but among those 80 years, people spend about 12 and a half years sick, right? So if you think about the sick span in that time, and a lot of that is actually mental behavioral health and other neuropsychiatric conditions. The expectation is that if you were to remove or reduce that 12 and a half year time span for the average person in the US to just 11 years, so 1 year of savings, that would generate $1 trillion of economic activity in the US. So there are a lot of these things. There's like at the individual level, it's about like continuing to be productive. The previous panel was talking about how is it that we can construct environments to support people, et cetera. But I think that at some point, what's missing in a lot of the discussions for us is how is it that you actually bring that preventative component? And because it's so multifactorial, we lose this ability to look at the big picture and it's like big, small problems. It's like again, for public, actually it's great that Phyllis and I are at either ends of this, right? Because we represent what was the original sin of medicine in the US. Right? So the Flexner report in 1920 separated the ability to do public health and epidemiology from doing allopathic medicine. And that then became this setup basically for almost every health system in the in the world. And it's really unfortunate, right? Because you went from a place where people were providing care in the home, in the community, understanding what was happening, and doing that Bayesian prior that I was describing earlier in their heads because they saw what was going on in their communities. And now we say we're going to build a city of hospitals and people have to commute here to us, right? That has worked really well for a lot of reasons. But when it comes to some of the access points, to some of the understanding of what is it that actually is making us not be able to prevent some of these conditions, or maybe even be causing some of them, we have no way to be able to triangulate any of the stuff that's happening outside of the body, which we can now measure in so many different ways, because we don't understand the context in which people live.
Yeah, no, wonderfully said and stated. I think healthcare is a business that our grandparents would have said, do not go into. There's essentially no margin. You might get paid a fraction for the work that you actually did. And let's face it, we are incentivized to do perhaps the wrong treatments. It's more profitable, I use this word for the lack of a better one, to do a procedure when perhaps it's education and prevention. And we got to change this once and for all. And here's why I'm hopeful, because I think that the brain economy change and the technology with AI, we are coming to a point where all of the advances we are making, we won't be able to harness them unless we drive significant and real change, including policies. And that brings me to your question. What are the barriers you think, Farrell, we need to overcome, particularly here in the US, to achieve lower cost, higher quality health intervention and change the system? It's an easy question.
Sure, no problem.
Give us the answer.
I wish I could tell you there was one silver bullet. I think that's part of the problem. But it's interesting, you were talking about the public health system. So the first set of programs that we ran for DAC and early detection, we ran 7 sites in 6 countries, 3 in low and middle income countries and 3 in high resource countries. And we thought, oh, we're Americans. We're going to solve this problem, right? The US is going to be better. Let me tell you, these low and middle income countries were running circles around the high resource countries. And the reason was this: their public health and clinical medical systems were still integrated. So Brazil, for example, they used community mental health workers. So we would go to doctors in the US and we'd say, hey, early detection of cognitive impairment is important. And be like, no, we don't want to do that. We don't get paid for it. There's no drug for it. There's no incentive, this, that, and the other is, you know, USPSTF, whatever. So, but then in Brazil, we would go to the community mental health workers and we'd say, hey, early detection is important. They'd be like, it sure is. I was just in this person's house and I just saw what happened when they're going undiagnosed. And they weren't sitting around waiting for a drug to fix the problem. And so it was just this dramatic mindset shift. Now, luckily, we do have some new therapies here in the US and we are seeing some movement, but it is not fast enough. And I'll give you a very stark example. We have an annual wellness visit. Everybody in the United States of America over the age of 65 has a legislative right to a cognitive assessment in the annual wellness visit. They have a legislative right to it. We have the US Preventative Services Task Force, which also sits under HHS, that does not recommend cognitive assessments, including over the age of 65. So we have this breakdown. Well, I mean, I'll ask you, what percentage of Americans in the US do you think get a standardized cognitive assessment, not the mini-cog, but a standardized cognitive assessment in their electronic medical record every year on their annual wellness visit? 4%. 4% of people over the age of 65. 65! I think we should be doing this at 50. So I would really like to see a greater sense of urgency to fix some of these things. This isn't sexy. It's not like great brand new science. It's like, guys, just go fix the legislation we have today and make it match and make it follow the science that we know now. So if I had to wave my magic wand, I'd have AWVs done for everybody and I'd have the USPSTF fixed today.
I think if you want that to happen, I think you need stable, aligned incentives. And what I mean by that is, if you look at CMMI historically, 40+ payment models have been tried, right? They change the rules, every other month, right? In terms of, we pay this and then it ratchets up and you used to save, but you don't save. Can you imagine if the Fed changed their, sort of interest rate policy? The markets would be all over the place, right? But that's what we've done in healthcare,
kind of living
right?
it.
And so we need some stability, but we also need aligned incentives that have dual-sided risk. And I think we're heading in that direction. But unless you have risk on both sides, right, you're not going to economically have the motivation to make the investments for the types of interventions and screening that you're describing.
But I would put the incentives after those policy changes, because what happens is doctors will waive USPSTF and say, no, it's an I don't have to do it. Then you start peeling back the onion, and the issue isn't so much the USPSTF, because guess what? Doctors do things all the time that they want to in the US that are off-label, right? But they don't have the incentives. They don't have quality metrics. We don't have STAR or HEDIS ratings. So all of these things that we have in these other disease states, we're purely fine to use the tincture of time. I mean, if you found a lump in your breast, women, and you went to the doctor and said, I found a lump in my breast, and the doctor said, let's give it a year and see what happens, what would you do? Find another doctor, right? But that's exactly what happens today if someone goes into the doctor's office, not because they're bad doctors, but because they don't have biomarkers, they don't have the cognitive assessments, things aren't paid for, they don't have the education, and until recently, they didn't have therapies where it mattered that we treat early, and now we have them. So
And part
I
of it,
just want us to move.
they're not at risk for the consequences of
They
waiting.
don't have a value-based care system, exactly, yeah.
You know, can I highlight one
Yeah.
point that probably is a little bit not right on target, but I think, you know, we heard several times today, but even in the session, the word DPRIT. I'm fascinated not by the word DPRIT. I'm fascinated by the P in the word DPRIT, which is prevention. Now, that's where I want to bring a little bit, you know, it makes sense for cancer. We all know that preventing cancer will cut the cost dramatically of taking care of a person with a metastatic cancer. But now they introduce this concept, is coming more and more into dementia. So we were talking about biomarkers before, and there were biomarkers to be included in a clinical trial or to monitor the clinical trial. But what we really need are biomarkers that are predictive, that can tell us beyond the 3 genes. Remember, we just have 3 genes that will induce, for sure, Alzheimer. All the rest, we don't know. 95% of cases are idiopathic, which is a fancy word. We have no idea why they occur. So they call it idiopathic, so they can charge you more. The doctor, right? Classic. But, and so, because going into that particular route and call it prevention, really understand, first of all, the evidence of people that are destined that trajectory, but before the trajectory goes down. Because if you go to the doctor when you cannot remember what you ate for breakfast and that sort of stuff, probably you already are not in the most efficient phase of the disease to be, and experience have taught us that. But also use technology to really be able, and wearable devices that will be able to tell us what is this population. Collectively, there is a sum of evidence or symptoms that suggest that individual. Maybe it could be a biomarker like that, which is not a biomarker, it's a marker in that case. I don't know, AI reading the EEG, my EEG, taking it and say, all this garble over here seems to be suggestive. In order to direct the effort and also to the prevention phase. And I think we need to focus on the prevention. It's really important. It's a very underexplored area of this.
The Lancet Commission only came out in September of 2024. I mean, that's how recent that we've actually got some good prevention data. And it's incredibly motivating for patients and for doctors, because now they do have something they can have a conversation about.
Well, because, you know, we have now, of course, the antibody, anti-A beta. We are all excited about it. And, but, you know, the example I gave my students is always the same, and allow me to give it to this public as well. Blocking A beta with an antibody when you have a demented individuals is like you're trying to take care of a gunshot wound, okay, by putting the gun into safe. Mm-hmm. Fine. You might not get the second shot, but the damage that has been done is there. And so, because of the incredible evidence of A beta as a driver, I mean, if you have a person with Down syndrome and he lives long enough, it will develop Alzheimer's disease.
Absolutely.
95% of the cases, because the chromosome 21 contains the G for APP, which is the precursor to A beta. So A beta is foundational, but when is foundational? That's the problem. If A beta will keep playing that role, then the antibody will stop the disease. The fact that only it slows down, very important. I'm not trying to diminish the importance of the antibody, indicates that at that point, what A beta is doing is, yes, some damage, but the huge damage has been done maybe 20 years before. We need to go back and really understand what's happening, because that would be efficient from an economic point of view, so resources needs to be targeted to this.
You made an underlying statement about cancer, which is we save money when we prevent cancer. We won't save money when we prevent Alzheimer's disease.
Right. And you know, I like the panel is now going, right?
Personally.
So we could keep going.
Yes,
and no, before we open it up, though, I do want to point out it's something as a molecular biologist, cancer, we want to kill cancers, or we want them from ever even occurring. Biology, we have to treat, we have to restore, we have to prevent, we have to modify.
Regenerative,
It's a very different type of approach, and we generally haven't done that well with it. And it's now about time. What I like about this panel is that you have a basic scientist talking to policy. You seem like, why would I even care? It's so far outside of the spectrum. You need to care. We need to come together early on. And we have now, with AI, I really believe this, we have the computing power to do this. Some people told me 20 years ago, we'll never understand the brain because we can't understand something that defines us. We need something that's smarter than us. I'm not saying AI is going to be smarter than us, but certainly it can create IQs of 300, 400, 500 in not too far distant future. Maybe not with all the complexity that the human brain is, but we will have soon the tools, together with the biology we already have, to understand us. So this is the moment when we can drive meaningful change. I'm going to go back to you, Andrew, to give you the final words on this part of the discussion, and then we open it up to the panel.
I'm reflecting on actually coming back to the, like, we framed the panel about innovation. And I think you've heard a bit about all of the different stakeholders in getting something from a discovery, right, like really 0 to 1, all the way to like everyone is going to benefit. And I was reflecting on a book that, it was actually the last book of Clay Christensen. It was a HBS professor. Right before he passed away, he published the Prosperity Paradox. And this worked, he became very famous in Silicon Valley for the innovator's dilemma. So it's this idea that we all hear about from 0 to 1, right? So like, what does it take to actually take an idea and develop it? And the lesson in that, in the case studies were world-changing technologies. What did it mean to go from a horse-drawn carriage to the automobile, right? Like really big changes, as you can imagine. And what was fascinating in the story is that you find that there's coexistence between these technologies for some time, and then usually regulators come in, right? But only after there's harm, which is fascinating. You think about it, right? So you had people who before could probably walk in the same place as a horse, and yes, you probably didn't want to get hit by the horse-drawn carriage either, but now with an automobile that can go twice as fast, you're probably likely to die, right? So then you suddenly had stop signals and sidewalks and different lanes. And when it comes to medicine, we started with the regulations, right? Not always around efficacy, right? First it was just claim to us what it is that you're actually putting in the bottle, right? So that the snake oil is not actually mineral oil, it's actually snake oil, right? Because that is supposedly great. And then in I think it was 1962, we moved into like actually testing for efficacy. But that entire ecosystem actually makes it very difficult to do the 0 to 1 work that we've been talking about. All of the efforts that Phyllis described running the clinical studies is in service to the regulator, but that's already way too far down the lane because we haven't been able to do this innovation. And we think about what is it that citizens want, what is it that people have been clamoring for. Anyone who's touched by this disease would say the same thing. We just want to try. We want to be in those studies. We want, just give it to us and let us try to learn. And of course, it would be a missed opportunity if we didn't collect the data, if we didn't have the predictive algorithms and the AI to be able to best match people. But we are not yet in the position to talk about that because everything is right now kind of locked up in this. We have to work around, how do we get the biomarker over the line? What's the commercial incentive? How is it that this is actually going to drive, future development? So one of the things that perhaps we can all think about collectively here, I mean, we meet in these meetings like this for some action. One of the things that we may be able to take forward is how is it that we may be able to push for earlier access to these clinical studies, right? How can we gather the data that Julia needs in the study design so that we can build the digital twins and then identify folks faster, right? And Tim's project in Chicago is a great example of like how to do this. But I think fundamentally, the pieces right now are that the roles of the funders and of the groups that right now are standing to look for safety and efficacy have actually been the wet blanket on what has been pretty active work, actually. And so if I were to leave with any one commentary, if anything's worthwhile from my perspective, is the fact that we live in a really magical time, right? This is a moment right now. I shared with the panel when we were prepping for this, but Arthur C. Clarke in the 1960s described any technology advanced sufficiently enough appears to be magic for people. And we have not just one magical thing, right? Everyone can point to ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude and say like, wow, that's really magical. And my 10-year-old even sees that it's magical, right? I mean, it truly is magical what the chatbots do, but we forget that medicine is magical. The approach that we have taken to develop these data, to leverage some computing, but really just to understand the really basic building blocks of what make us up, it is way beyond our comprehension. And I think that that's one of the things that I feel really excited about, like how do we tie these things together? But we have to continue to embrace that and not continue to slow it down.
Wonderful, wonderful. No, I think it's really important to come together at panels like this, meetings like this. I have the type of follow-up. I myself, so just that you know, I got through this by listening to a brain economy talk. I give Dr. Harris Ira a lot of credit. He presented this morning. I listened to him in September last year, and now is not even a year ago, and we are heavily invested in this changing brain economy and trying to do everything we can. And we are learning, and I think some people are learning from us. And I hope that more and more will join that movement. I'm excited about the state of Texas being an ideal breeding ground for novel developments and really an impactful change that can be emulated in other states in the US and also around the entire globe. So with that said, thank you, our panelists. Fantastic. Thank you, audience, and have a good evening.